the fertilizers section in the matric chemistry paper is largely used to provide context and a number of different real-world applications where rates of reaction and chemical equilibrium can be tested, but there are a number of theoretical items that need to be understood for this section. First is that plants require non-mineral nutrients. Those are considered carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. Those are obtained from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide and water. The mineral nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, are obtained from the soil and then obviously from fertilizers. So for each of these nutrients, it's necessary to know their function. We know that nitrogen promotes leaf growth and it also plays a role in the color of the leaf, and it also promotes plant size or growth. We know that phosphorus is involved in the root growth in plants and also helps with disease resistance, and potassium promotes fruit or flower quality and growth. It supports photosynthesis and it also helps in temperature resistance to drought. Then we need to know what the source of each of these minerals is. We know that nitrogen comes from manure or guano, which is essentially bird droppings, and most often in the form of ammonium nitrate or urea. Phosphorus is most commonly found in bone meal or phosphates, and potassium comes from wood ash, also known as potash, and potassium salts. The production part of this is important because there are a number of reactions here. Specifically, most of them are reversible reactions which set up a chemical equilibrium which allow us to ask questions around the equilibrium constant and Le Chatelier's principle. But what's important to understand here is that the Haber process is used in the production of ammonia. The Ostwald process is used in the production of nitric acid, and the contact process is used in the production of sulfuric acid. Then if we take those products there and we combine ammonia with nitric acid, we would form ammonium nitrate, which is one of the main sources of nitrogen in plants. If we combine the ammonia with sulfuric acid, we would form ammonium sulfate, which is also a very good source of nitrogen for plants. And then another source of nitrogen is fractional distillation of liquid air, where essentially you cool the air down until it becomes liquid, and because nitrogen boils at a very low temperature of 169 degrees Celsius, it will boil first, and you can therefore separate the nitrogen from the other air elements. Phosphorus is most often found in rock phosphates, which is combined with phosphoric acid or sulfuric acid to form a superphosphate. Potassium is most often mined, and it comes in the form of potassium chloride, potassium nitrate, or potassium sulfate. Once again, this is the theoretical component of fertilizers. There is a practical component, but what is most important is understanding these reactions that are involved in the production, because they can be used and tested in rates of reactions and chemical equilibrium. The NPK ratio in a fertilizer gives us an indication of the ratio in which the primary nutrients are present in a bag of fertilizer. So a typical bag of fertilizer would give you the mass of fertilizer, and then this ratio over here, which we know to be the NPK ratio, that tells us that this ratio here is 3 parts nitrogen, 1 part phosphorus, and 5 parts potassium. This over here refers to the percentage purity, essentially just to help us understand that this bag is not entirely fertilizer. There is something called filler that makes up the bulk of this bag. So the questions would normally range from calculate the mass of fertilizer in this bag, where we know that this is the percentage purity, which essentially tells us that only 36% of this mass is fertilizer. So we can calculate the actual mass of fertilizer by taking the mass of the bag, which is 20 kilograms, and multiplying it by that percentage purity, 36 over 100, to find that 7.2 kilograms of this 20 is fertilizer, which then obviously means that the other 12.8 kilograms is filler. Then you could be asked for the mass of nitrogen, and as we can see, this ratio makes up 9 parts, 3 plus 1 plus 5, and of those 9 parts, nitrogen is 3. So we say 3 over 9 multiplied by the mass of fertilizer in this bag. Again, fertilizer is only 7.2 kilograms, and that tells us that in this bag we will find 2.4 kilograms of nitrogen. The same calculation can be made for phosphorus, where we see that 1 part in 9 is phosphorus, mass of fertilizer is 7.2, so 0.8 kilograms of fertilizer is phosphorus, and finally 5 of the 9 parts are potassium, which means that in this bag we will find 4 kilograms of potassium. The Haber process is the process required to produce ammonia, and that is by combining nitrogen that is obtained from fractional distillation of liquid air with hydrogen, which is obtained from a reaction between coal and steam. And as we can see here, this reaction has a negative enthalpy change, which means that it is exothermic. Now, in the industry, when we are trying to produce as much ammonia as possible, theoretically, what we can see here from Le Chatelier's principle is that the way to favor the forward reaction and produce as much ammonia as possible would be to do it at a low temperature, because we know that the forward reaction is exothermic, so the lower the temperature, the more we would favor the forward reaction. The second thing that we would try to do is we would maintain high concentrations of our reactants, those being nitrogen and hydrogen, and we would constantly remove the ammonia that's produced. That way, we constantly requiring this reaction to favor the forward to produce more ammonia and try and undo that high concentration that we have added. And then what we find in reality is the following. In reality, this reaction needs to take place at a slightly higher temperature, normally somewhere between 400 and 500 degrees Celsius. The reason for that is that this reaction would take place very, very slowly if we did it at normal room temperature. So we prefer to do it at a higher temperature to increase the rate of reaction. Obviously, what that does do is it makes us favor the reverse reaction. So a number of changes are required in order to, again, favor the forward reaction that produces more of our products. The first one is that we add a catalyst. The catalyst that we would use here is iron oxide, and again, that would speed up the rate of reaction. The second change that we would make here is we would do this reaction at a very high pressure, normally somewhere between 200 and 400 atmospheres. As we can see, because the forward reaction produces fewer molecules, only 2 molecules, whereas the reverse reaction produces 4 molecules, a high pressure would favor the forward reaction and again produce more ammonia in this reaction. So here we have a nice example of how we use Le Chatelier's principle and rates of reactions in the fertilizer industry. We have a theoretical prediction that says this is an exothermic reaction, therefore lower temperatures, higher concentration of reactants, and constantly removing products would be the best way to produce as much product as possible. But then what that does not take into account is the rate of reaction, which is why we have this difference between theory and reality, where in reality it is necessary to have a high temperature so that we have a rate of reaction that occurs fast enough for us to produce enough for this to be economically viable in industry. And then that high temperature is compensated for by introducing a catalyst into the system and doing this reaction at a very high pressure that then once again forces us to favor the forward reaction that produces as much ammonia as possible. The Ostwald process is a 3-step process that starts with ammonia and ends up with nitric acid that we can use to produce ammonium nitrate and various other compounds that are required in the fertilizer industry and in industry as a whole. So the first step in this process is where we react our ammonia with oxygen in the presence of a catalyst, either platinum or rhodium, that forms nitrogen monoxide and water. That nitrogen monoxide is then taken into the second step where it is reacted with oxygen once again to produce nitrogen dioxide. That nitrogen dioxide is then added to water to finally produce nitric acid. What we can see here is that it also produces some nitrogen monoxide, which is then recycled back into the second step. So you have a slightly cyclical process here. What we can also see as part of our rates and equilibrium section is that this reaction in step 2, nitrogen monoxide plus oxygen, those are both clear gases, where nitrogen dioxide is a brown gas. And so you could have various questions coming from Le Chatelier's principle relating to the color change that takes place when you make changes to that reaction. So once again, very simply, the Ostwald process sees us converting through a series of 3 reactions, converting ammonia eventually into nitric acid that is used in our fertilizer industry. The contact process is the third important process in the fertilizer industry. As you can see, it ends with the production of sulfuric acid that we use in a number of our fertilizer minerals. So the process starts with burning of sulfur and oxygen to form sulfur dioxide. As you can see here, this is also a one-directional reaction, and it is shown as such. From there, we take the sulfur dioxide and react it with oxygen again in a reversible reaction to form sulfur trioxide. That is then reacted with some sulfuric acid to form H2S2O7, also known as oleum. That oleum is then reacted with water to form sulfuric acid. This may seem counterintuitive because what we are saying here is we're saying that we use sulfuric acid in the production of sulfuric acid, but what you should be able to see here is that we're starting with 1 mole of sulfuric acid here and producing 2 moles of sulfuric acid. So the process is worth its while because it does actually produce more sulfuric acid than it requires for the process. As with all of these processes, we feel that it's important to have an understanding for the steps involved here, because you start to get an idea of how the industry operates, and that it's not just one simple reaction that gives you what you want, but very often a number of reactions that are needed to go through in order to produce the end product that you are aiming for.